Oh yes, well when you work with yourself with a film crew, you haven't got a director. You are the director as well as the reporter. But the cameraman is himself a director. The cameraman picks his own shots. In the absence of a director, we all do a bit of everything. In those days we had a big crew, a big film crew. Everywhere I went, I had to take a cameraman, a sound recordist and an electrician, as well as myself. There were always at least 4 of us. And if we were filming in the afternoon for the following day, we had to have an assistant cameraman as well, because of the strict union rules at that time. So filming in the afternoon for the following day, there were at least 5 of us. Seems ridiculous today, but that's the way it was. And very strict rules about who does what. I wasn't allowed to physically touch the film. Never mind the camera. That's the way it happened. Most of the important interviews were done by our political editor, Max Perkins, very highly respected. But if he wasn't available, I interviewed people like Margaret Thatcher, on that famous occasion in Brecon Market. And Michael Foot, I went back and forth there a few times to his home in Tredegar and recorded interviews which were used on News at 10 at the time, particularly when he was employment minister. And his own constituency was hit by the closure of Eastmoor, or Ebble Vale Steelworks rather. Eastmoor's in Cardiff went about the same time, with thousands and thousands of jobs. And although he was employment minister, he was struggling to cope with that. One of the stories I covered in West Wales, well actually before I moved to West Wales, I was sent from Cardiff to check out reports that UFOs were being unidentified flying saucers were being spotted all over the place in Pembrokeshire. This was creating a lot of interest internationally, actually. The world's media were turning up in Pembrokeshire to check out stories that strange spacemen were being seen, that spacecraft had landed in a local farm and outside a local hotel. I checked into a local hotel, and the landlady there turned out to be I thought she was quite dotty, and she described to me on camera in detail how a spacecraft had landed on her lawn. Now, I think she may have had mental health problems because there was no evidence for this at all. So she was either totally bonkers or she was cashing in as a tourism operator on what was happening mostly around the village of Little Haven and Broadhaven. School children drew pictures of men in spacesuits they said they'd seen from the school playing field. It was an interesting story, but about 20 or 30 years later, members of the local Rotary Club confessed that they'd been dressing up as the spacemen and they had everyone fooled. I think they were too embarrassed to own up at the time. Things had gone a bit out of hand. They'd gone too far. But decades later, they confessed it was they who had everybody fooled. Yes, Winford Vaughan Thomas was one of our mentors as young reporters in H.T.V. He was actually program controller for a while when I started, and he was also a director of the company. He was a linchpin of the company. Famous war correspondent, of course. He must have been in his 60s in that time, but still very active, still making wonderful programs for H.T.V. about the great little trains of Wales, and he was still rock climbing up into his 70s, I think. Knew more about the countryside of Wales than anybody else. He didn't interfere with us in the newsroom unless we got a pronunciation wrong. Then he'd come running in after the program. A particular bugbear he had was pronunciation of Gower. You should never say on the Gower. You always have to say on Gower. He insisted on that anglicised way of saying Gower. Little things like that used to annoy him, but generally he left us alone. He often used to come for a drink with the journalists in the studio club afterwards. And I remember I used to ask him to recite his poetry. There was a poem I particularly liked about a vampire, imaginary vampire, of course, in Swansea, who used to go around attacking local councillors and Winford had written a poem about this. I remember one line was, councillors, aldermen, suck I with glee. Oh, for the veins of a juicy J.P. So Winford would hold court and he'd recite his poetry to us. Wonderful man.
Green light flashes on the control tower. That's the sign. It's our turn to go now. We're forced to go. And the whole of our 4 engines are giving out a full-throated roar as we start to slowly gather speed down the 1.5 mile long runway.
But he would talk about the bombing raid over Berlin. God knows how he must have had some guts to do that, because when he got in that bomber, there was a fair chance they wouldn't come back. But he still played to this day his description of the bombs dropping with a strange beauty on Berlin at that time. He said it was like watching diamonds exploding on black velvet. They let the cargo of bombs, and thousands of feet below, they would see them they wouldn't hear them, but he said it was like diamonds hitting velvet.
And that's our last sight of it. Just a great glow in the sky, and around that glow, a feathery spray of searchlights. And now we are 600 miles to go for home.
One thing he would never talk about was the liberation of Belsen. Winford was one of the first on the scene when the British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen, the concentration camp. It affected him so profoundly, he would never speak about it. I remember going to Winford's house in Fishguard, and he insisted on opening a bottle of wine, one of the famous Burgundies that he'd brought back from France with him from his days as a war correspondent. I think it was in 1947. Beautiful, beautiful wine, which you could feel warming your tummy as soon as you took a sip of it. Must have been very, very strong. With that, Mrs. Vaughan Thomas came in and she said, "Winford, I thought you were keeping that wine till Christmas." And Winford said, "But dear," he said, "I don't possess any bad wine. It's all good wine." And I realised then this must have been what part of the wine that Winford had kept from a cellar. He called it his cellar in London, which he sold for over £2 million back in the 1980s. The French presented him with so much wine because he was regarded as a national hero in France. And the reason was that when the Allies were moving up through France after D-Day, Winford was credited, rightly or wrongly, with persuading the Allied generals to fight their way around the best vineyards instead of smashing their way through them. I don't know if the story is true or not, but Winford himself used to say there was a French officer who said to the generals, I know the exact positions of the enemy locations, mon général. They are all in vineyards of inferior vintage. So for whatever reason, it was a crucial time in the grape harvest, and the best French vineyards were spared, and Winford himself was honoured. He had medals, and and he came back with some wonderful wine after the war. Richard Burton, as we know, was one of the most important directors of H.T.V. In fact, I think at one time he and his wife Elizabeth Taylor were the biggest shareholders in the company. Although typically, I don't think Richard himself knew how much money he had invested in the company. My colleague Michael Williams did a famous interview with Richard Burton, who was one of our company directors, on the train to Fishguard to film Under Milkwood, when he took Burton 40 Woodbines and a couple of bottles of Strumpy Jack. And Richard was very appreciative of this, because he was starting to get very dry by the time he reached Cardiff en route to Fishguard. And when he saw the Woodbines, he said, "Good God, I haven't seen these for years." I remember rushing back from the Lampert or Eisteddfod, having got news of Richard Burton's death in 1984, and going straight from there with my camera crew to the memorial service, which has been held in the village of Pontryd of Ven, where Burton was from, near Port Talbot. I couldn't get a position for my cameraman inside the chapel. There were a lot of people there, as you know. It was a very important event. But I remember Graham Jenkins, Richard's brother, coming up to me, and he said, "Where the hell have you been?" I said, "I'm very sorry, Graham, but I've been covering the Eisteddfod in Lampeter, and we got here as quickly as we could." "No," he said, "you can't have a, you're too late." He said, "You can't have a position inside the chapel," which is very unreasonable. But I realised afterwards that grief and bereavement does awful things to a person, and I've never held that against him. But I did manage to record some good sound outside of the singing, and in fact, that was more effective. What I did to hide the fact that I didn't have a cameraman inside the service was that I shot emotional-looking faces in the churchyard outside, and I recorded the sound of hymn singing, which was very moving. And in fact, I think the news item ended up better for it. No, there was a reason that Elizabeth wasn't there. She said afterwards, because she was such a big star, there would have been a big fuss if she turned up, and she didn't want to detract from the family's day. It was a day for the family. She didn't want to be the object of attention and have all the fuss about her. So she turned up a couple of days later. Richard's current wife was there, Sally, and I spoke to the minister of the chapel afterwards, and he showed me where Richard and Elizabeth had both intended to be buried. They bought a plot in the churchyard, in the yard of the chapel. They intended to be buried there together, but of course it didn't work out that way. Richard was buried in Salini, his home in exile in Switzerland, and I think Elizabeth in the end ended up, I think her funeral was in California. So that plot remains empty to this day. But the minister told me they'd bought it and paid for it. When Elizabeth Taylor herself turned up in Pontcanna, there was quite a fuss. She turned up in 3 cars. We knew she was coming. We filmed her arrival outside this row of very modest terraced houses where Richard's family still lived. The 3 cars drove up, huge cars. Elizabeth herself was in one with Graham, Richard's brother. She was in one car. The other 2 cars were absolutely stuffed full of gifts for the family. So there were 3 cars, one for Elizabeth, 2 for the gifts that she'd brought with her from America for Richard's family. And they still, although they were divorced, the family in Pontcanna were still very fond of Elizabeth. Goodness knows how they got all those gifts in the house, because even one of those limousines was longer than the front of each terraced house. So goodness knows where they put the presents. Confessions of a TV newsman. It's still for sale on Amazon. I can't remember how much it costs, but it's very reasonably priced. And because it's an electronic book, it's still selling and has been for the past 6 years or more. Well, I'm hoping to publish my short stories. The 3 short stories I've ended up with in my time in Lampeter. I'm hoping they'll be interesting enough for a publisher. That remains to be seen now.